Julie Jennings ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, though no one had actually elected her to do so. As head of the HOA, she prided herself on enforcing the most ridiculous rules, ones that seemed to change at her convenience. Trash cans left on the curb a minute too long? Fine. A mailbox not painted in the approved shade of beige? Violation notice. Wind chimes that work too loud? Immediate removal demanded. Most neighbors tolerated her out of fear or exhaustion. Few had the energy to fight against someone who treated the HOA like her personal kingdom. But the moment Andrew Phillips moved into the community, Julie's passive-aggressive tendencies turned into outright hostility. Andrew was everything she despised. Successful, confident, and worst of all, someone she couldn't intimidate. A self-made entrepreneur with a thriving real estate business, he had moved into the neighborhood for its peace and quiet, not realizing he'd walked straight into Julie's war zone. From the day he arrived, she made it clear she didn't want him there. She sent him an HOA welcome packet, filled with rules that didn't apply to anyone else. Within a week, she accused him of violating landscaping regulations because his grass was too tall, even though it was freshly cut. The next week, she called a tow truck to remove his perfectly registered luxury SUV from his own driveway, claiming it was an eyesore. Her most outrageous stunt came when she called 911, reporting a suspicious man trespassing in the neighborhood. That suspicious man was Andrew, gardening in his own yard. When the police arrived, Andrew calmly explained that he was, in fact, the homeowner. The officers, recognizing Julie's name, sighed before leaving. "You again?" one muttered, shaking his head at her. Julie didn't care. She wasn't just trying to enforce HOA rules, she was trying to run Andrew out. And when he didn't leave, she became obsessed with making his life unbearable. Julie escalated her attacks. If subtle intimidation didn't work, she would make Andrew life a bureaucratic nightmare. She started by planting fake HOA violation notices on his door, infractions that didn't exist. One day, she claimed his fence was an inch too high. The next, she alleged that his door color violated community guidelines, even though 4 other houses had the same shade. When Andrew ignored her nonsense, she went further. She altered HOA meeting minutes to claim he had violated multiple policies and began rallying neighbors to sign a petition for his removal. Most of them, tired of Julie's antics, refused. But some, those who shared her prejudices or feared her retaliation, went along. Her boldest move yet? She called the police again. This time, she didn't just claim Andrew was trespassing, she accused him of being a threat to the neighborhood. The officers arrived, but Andrew, always calm under pressure, stood his ground. He provided proof of ownership, forcing Julie to watch in humiliation as they walked away without taking action. Before leaving, one officer turned to Julie and said, "Ma'am, if you keep calling us for nonsense, we'll be forced to take action against you." Julie saw red. She had lost this battle, but she refused to lose the war. "I'll find a way to get him out," she muttered under her breath. And in that moment Andrew knew, she wasn't going to stop. But what Julie didn't realize, Andrew was done playing defense. And soon, he would deliver the kind of justice she never saw coming. Andrew had endured enough of Julie's harassment. He had tried reasoning with her, standing his ground, even ignoring her, but she refused to stop. Now it was time to fight back. Being a real estate investor, Andrew had access to databases and property records that most people didn't. Out of curiosity, he decided to look up Julie's house. Maybe he could find some technicality in property laws that would force her to back off. What he found made his heart race with excitement. Julie didn't even own her house. The property was registered under a real estate investment firm. And that firm? Andrew was a majority stakeholder in it. He owned Julie's house. It took him a moment to process the sheer irony of the situation. Here was a woman who had tried everything in her power to remove him from the neighborhood, and yet she was living under a roof that belonged to him. But the surprises didn't stop there. Andrew, Curious about what else she might be hiding, dug deeper. He searched through old court records, background checks, and financial histories. And then he found it. Julie had a criminal past. Years ago, she had been arrested for running a fraudulent rental scam. She had posed as a landlord, collecting deposits and rent payments from desperate tenants, for properties she didn't even own. When the real owners eventually stepped in, Julie disappeared with the money, leaving families homeless. She had been convicted of fraud and served time in prison. But somehow, she had managed to bury the records, likely using legal loopholes and intimidation. But Andrew knew now. And he knew exactly how to make sure karma caught up with her. It was time to turn the tables. Andrew wasn't just going to expose Julie. He was going to make her feel every ounce of humiliation she had put him through. He called for a mandatory HOA meeting, making sure Julie believed it was finally her moment of victory. Smug as ever, she arrived with her usual self-satisfied strut, fully expecting to put an end to Andrew time in her neighborhood. She had a list of fabricated violations prepared, ready to demand his removal. As she rambled on about non-existent infractions, Andrew calmly reached into his folder and pulled out a single piece of paper. The room fell silent. Julie frowned. "What is that?" Andrew smiled. "Your lease agreement." Her face drained of color. He let the words sink in before dropping the bombshell. "Julie, you don't own your house." "I do." The silence was deafening. Andrew explained, in excruciating detail, that her home was owned by his real estate firm. He had the legal right to evict her for violating community policies, the very rules she had used to harass others. Julie stammered, shaking her head in denial. "That's impossible," she screeched. "Oh, it's very possible," Andrew continued, his tone cool and composed. "And it gets worse for you. Her criminal past? No longer buried." Andrew had already contacted the authorities. With his resources, he had reopened her fraud case, bringing attention to parole violations she thought she had escaped. Her face twisted in panic. She screamed, cursed, and begged, but Andrew simply stood his ground, watching as reality crashed down on her. Her own weapon, abusing authority and manipulating rules, had turned against her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Julie was spiraling. Her entire world had flipped upside down. Just yesterday, she was the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, ruling with an iron fist. Now, she was facing eviction and a criminal investigation. But Julie wasn't the type to go down quietly. "You think you can do this to me?" she shrieked at Andrew, her voice trembling with rage. "I'll sue you for everything you've got. I'll take you to court." Andrew just chuckled. "Julie," he said smoothly, leaning against his luxury SUV, the very one she had complained about. "I am the court." She had no idea just how powerful Andrew really was. With his high-profile legal team, the eviction process had been fast-tracked. There were no loopholes left for Julie to exploit. The very next day, a sheriff's car pulled up to her driveway. She froze as two uniformed officers stepped out. One held a document. An eviction notice. "Ms. Julie Monroe," the sheriff announced. "By order of the property owner, you are hereby evicted. You have until this evening to vacate the premises." Julie's face twisted in fury. She tried everything. Screaming, crying, threatening lawsuits, even falling to her knees in fake hysteric. "You can't do this," she wailed. "This is my home. I built this community." The officers didn't budge. The irony was delicious. The very police she had weaponized against Andrew, over gardening, mowing his lawn, and simply existing, were now the ones removing her from her house. But the worst was yet to come. Just as she stood on the curb, surrounded by her suitcases and scattered belongings, another set of officers arrived. Two detectives, one holding a pair of handcuffs. Julie barely had time to process it before one officer spoke. "Julie Monroe? You're under arrest." Her mouth fell open. "You've been charged with fraud and parole violations related to your past rental scam. We have a warrant for your arrest." The color drained from her face. I don't understand, she stammered, her voice cracking. That was years ago. How did you even find out? Andrew just smiled. You really should have been nicer to your landlord, he said casually as the officers snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists. Julie screamed, thrashed, and cursed, but it was over. The HOA tyrant had finally fallen. With Julie gone, the entire neighborhood felt lighter. For years, she had terrorized homeowners with her absurd rules and power trip. Many residents had been too afraid to stand up to her. But now? She was history. That evening, Andrew found himself greeted by smiling neighbors. Some of them, people who had once avoided conflict, came to personally thank him for exposing Julie. We were scared of her, an elderly woman admitted, shaking her head. She made us feel like we'd lose everything if we didn't follow her rules. I can't believe she wasn't even the owner, another man laughed. All that power, and it wasn't even her house? There was an undeniable shift in the air, a collective relief. And Andrew? He simply smiled. He had never needed to raise his voice, break the law, or stoop to her level. Karma had handled everything for him. As he walked back to his luxurious home, the one Julie had tried so hard to take from him, he took a deep breath, enjoying the peace she had never allowed him to have. The HOA tyrant was gone. Justice was served. And the best part? Andrew had just gained another rental property, and a whole lot of peace. The end.